Okay, Olga, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to debate this issue today with you. It's important to us at the OECD, where I'm head of the Entrepreneurship Policy and Analysis Unit in the Centre for Entrepreneurship of the OECD. It's a big issue for us at OECD, and also it's a great pleasure to be able to do this here at Birkbeck, which is a great forum and a great college, and I'm privileged to be a visiting professor at the School of Management at Birkbeck. So for me, it's a double pleasure. So the topic is promoting equal opportunity between men and women in entrepreneurship, and really to ensure that entrepreneurship policies in the OECD member countries and elsewhere are inclusive of women entrepreneurs, which they won't necessarily be if it's a sort of a gender blind approach, as has been the case until now. So just before the summer, it was in June, the OECD launched a new publication. It's called Entrepreneurship Policies Through a Gender Lens. And we did this in collaboration with the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Research Network, the GWEP Research Network. So we thank Colette, who's here, Colette Henry, and the GWEP team very much for that. It's a publication that you can access on the OECD iLibrary site. So if you just were to type in that title in Google, it would come up, or type in OECD iLibrary. You can read the publication online. There's a charge to download it, but you can read online. Basically, it examines trends and barriers in entrepreneurship by gender, and it's got 27 country-level policy insight notes that are authored by academic experts from that GWEP network. So the aim is to present some insights from around the world and be a guide for policymakers in future actions. This is just one of a series of OECD outputs in this field. You might know, perhaps you don't know, that female entrepreneurship is one of the key features of the 2013 OECD recommendation on gender equality in education, employment and entrepreneurship. So all the OECD countries have signed up to that gender recommendation. It commits them to taking actions to reduce the gender gap in entrepreneurship, and the OECD monitors their progress every 5 years. And then you might have come across our publication with the European Union. It's called The Missing Entrepreneurs. That's got the data on entrepreneurship, the country level actions, some thematic topics related to achieving equality in entrepreneurship across all the groups, women, but also youth, seniors, immigrants, the unemployed. And one last thing to mention is that we have an online Better Entrepreneurship Policy Toolkit. And that's a toolkit for policymakers. It gives them the chance to take a self-assessment and to access guidance as well on entrepreneurship for all these groups. So it points to a range of resources on women entrepreneurship, and it asks policymakers whether they think they've got the programs in place that they need, or whether they're using the right practices. Now, a few key messages from that overall work before we get into the real discussion. I'd like to just point to 4 points. Number one, women entrepreneurs are often disadvantaged in access to finance, in skills and networks. They tend to operate smaller businesses than men. But then again, they can also be very successful, and of course, women are not homogenous as a group of entrepreneurs. So that's point one. And point two would be that there's been a lot of progress in OECD countries in reducing the gender gap, or at least maybe I shouldn't say a lot of progress. There has been some progress in reducing the gender gap. both in terms of the share of women entrepreneurs and in terms of the share of growth businesses operated by women entrepreneurs. But yes, it was a bit of a marginal improvement, and it all stopped with the COVID-19 crisis. Third point would be that governments have introduced a range of interesting new policies, like women dedicated business incubators, women entrepreneur clubs. There's an increasing emphasis also on the overall ecosystem for women entrepreneurship support. And Canada, the Canadian government, is a model for that with its women entrepreneurship strategy. And the final point would be there's still a lot to be done, both in terms of individual actions and in terms of getting institutions right. And it should be remembered that the policy solution to the gender gap in entrepreneurship is not necessarily always to create dedicated entrepreneurship programs for women. So the answer could be in adapting mainstream entrepreneurship policies to the needs of women, making sure that there's a tracking of the share of beneficiaries by gender of these mainstream programs, and not forgetting the institutional conditions. So today we're going to take the agenda a bit further forwards by presenting and discussing this new publication, Entrepreneurship Policy Through a Gender Lens. We're going to have two great speakers, plenty of time for discussion, I hope, in the hour coming up. So Colette Henry will kick us off first of all. She's the head of Department of Business Studies at Dundalk Institute of Technology in Ireland, and an adjunct professor at Griffith University, Australia. Well, she edits the International Journal of Gender and Entrepreneurship, and she's a founder of the GWEP research network, which is so important in this area. So she'll take us through the book, the OECD GWEP book. Then we have Severine Loarne, who is from France. She'll take us through the example of women entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship policies in France as maybe a more detailed case example of how policy can be strengthened. She's a professor at Grenoble École de Management. She's founder and head of the research chair in female entrepreneurship for a renewed economy. So she has 23 affiliated researchers from 8 countries, and they look at renewing deprived areas through women entrepreneurship. So she's researching this issue and also women's creativity to innovate for climate change. And she's a member of the GWEP network, so they're very important here. So I think now what we do, we have the two presentations. Then we'll open up the discussion at the end of the presentations, but please feel free to put your comments and your questions in the chat as we go along. And then when we get up to the discussion period, raise your hand, I'll pick up points from the chat, and let's really hear your point of view on all this. So I think that's good. I think we can hand over to Colette. Are you ready to go, Colette?
Yes, Jonathan, thanks very much. I think Orla has kindly offered to put my slides up for me. So Orla, if you want to go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, just to say good afternoon, everyone. It's or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to be part of this debate. And thanks to Helen, Orla and the team at the Centre for Innovation Management Research at Birkbeck for hosting us today. So by way of laying the foundation for our discussion and hopefully your questions and comments, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the main findings from the report, which is a 27-country report published with the OECD and the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Network, Entrepreneurship Policies Through a Gender Lens. And Jonathan has kindly put the link to the report up in the chat. So if you click on that, you'll be able to read the report online. So before I start, can I just thank the 27 research teams, the country research teams who contributed to this report. At the minute, we have about 36 members in Global GWEP, but not all of them had joined by the stage that we were doing the report. So we've got 27 countries covered. Can I thank my co-editors, Professors Barbara Orser and Susan Coleman, and of course the OECD, Jonathan Potter and David Halabisky, who were fantastic to work with, and it's been a great collaboration for the Global GWEP group. So let me tell you a little bit about the report. If we could go to the next slide, please, Orla. So I'm not sure if you've heard of Global GWEP. I think more and more people are getting to hear about us now, but we're basically a network of academic researchers with a passion and an interest in women's entrepreneurship, and particularly from a policy perspective. We started the network in 2014 at one of the Diana International Research Conferences, the one in Stockholm. And essentially, it was a few ideas that we had. When I first started, I had about 5 countries who were interested in participating. By our first formal workshop, we had 13 countries, and now we've just got 36 actually, because Greece just joined a few days ago. So it's growing tremendously. It just shows, I think, the interest that's out there in not just women's entrepreneurship, but the policy issue, people really wanting to contribute to that debate. So next slide, please. Now, if you've had a chance to look at the report, you'll see that it's organised under a number of themes or pillars, and we had different countries highlighting policy issues under those themes. So we didn't dictate to our country teams the particular policy issues we wanted them to cover. We wanted them to choose what was the hot policy issue in their country that they wanted to highlight. And they fitted under these headings. So next slide, please. So if we move on, so in addition to the pillars, I sort of find this sort of 5 category framework quite useful just for taking a deeper look at some of the findings. So if you look at the top of that diagram there, it might come as no surprise that we found in the report that there were several countries that had absolutely no women's entrepreneurship policy at all. And as part of Global GWEP, we feel that that's a fundamental flaw in policy, because if a government is really serious about promoting women's entrepreneurship, then it's got to be mentioned in their formal overarching country policy. It can't just be an addendum. Now, this wasn't an uncommon finding. In most countries, there was either no dedicated women's entrepreneurship policy or references to women's entrepreneurship within mainstream policies were barely visible in some countries. An example here is Northern Ireland, actually, because the research team there concluded that the lower level of women entrepreneurs in the north of Ireland, where in fact women are about half as likely as men to become entrepreneurs, was due absolutely to the fact that there was no dedicated policy. And then sort of moving clockwise around that little diagram there, we also found countries with policies that were designed to promote women's entrepreneurship, but they didn't work very well, or they were seen to not work as well as they should. And not surprisingly, a number of countries fell into that category, mostly because their policies were at odds with other elements of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So in other words, there was something lacking, another aspect upon which that policy relied that just wasn't working. An unexpected example for us as researchers in this regard was in fact Germany. Now, we hear lots of very good reports about Germany. The level of women's entrepreneurship has actually gone up slightly, and you wouldn't think there'd be a problem there, but there is a sense from the German research team that any policies are designed around the male breadwinner model. So they sort of present entrepreneurship as a less desirable career for women. Another example, and perhaps one you might expect, is Pakistan, where the levels of women's entrepreneurship are amongst the lowest in the world, in fact. And there, the research team highlighted weak regulatory systems which facilitated discrimination, or limited access to financial capital, and lack of family and social care policies as the key ecosystem aspects that were preventing any emerging programme or policy from being effective. And then next we find a lot of countries with women's entrepreneurship policies where some of them did actually work. Now, I say a lot, so there were a few examples here. One in particular was actually Canada, and Jonathan's already mentioned that, because they have a very solid women's entrepreneurship strategy. And also in the UK, our author team there, headed up by Professor Helen Lawton-Smith, who's hosting us today, they highlighted that initiatives such as Women in Innovation Awards were really effective at encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation amongst women. And then, of course, there were some countries in the report that emerged as having no actual programs on the ground. So there was some women's entrepreneurship policy, but no actions on the ground to support that policy. One example we would highlight could be considered as Kenya, where women constitute almost half of micro to small enterprises and the largest proportion of the informal sector. Yet, despite the government recognising this in their policies, there was no programme of social protection or no dedicated programme for women in that particular sector. In some other countries, we find that policies lack the necessary targets or the specific criteria or evaluation frameworks to make them effective. So in other words, there was no sense of whether or not programmes actually worked. And finally, we sort of find the opposite to the previous category. We find some countries where there were some really good programmes on the ground, but no actual policy that was overarching those programmes. And again, for Global WEP, this is really important, because if the government wants to promote entrepreneurship, but if there's no government mandate visible, no policy that's reinforcing the need to support women's entrepreneurship, then there is a danger that programmes that emerge on the ground without that overarching policy support won't be sustainable. They're maybe reliant on recurring funding, so if that runs out, there's a problem. Or if perhaps the very passionate, dedicated person who's leading that programme decides to leave, again, there's no mandate to continue the programme. We were actually interested to find out that in Australia, for example, some of the programmes that are there for women's entrepreneurship, even though there's not an overarching policy, were supported by the corporate sector only. So again, no government funding for the programmes on the ground. Now, Ireland is actually a very good example here too, because they do have a government-funded programme on the ground, some very good ones, but when you look at the policy documents, women's entrepreneurship isn't platformed at all, or in fact, as I pointed out earlier, women's entrepreneurship is mentioned in a way that perhaps is detrimental. So if we could move to the next slide. So in terms of takeaways, what can we deduce from all of this? Well, one key point that keeps being evident across all the reports, across all the country briefs, is that where women are mentioned in policies, they're referred to as minority, lacking in skills, they're in deficit, or they need to be fixed. So that sort of narrative hasn't really changed. We find that access to financial capital was the top barrier reported by our country teams. In fact, it was the #1 policy issue in the report that is discussed by the teams. We sort of feel collectively that there's a need for actions to be implemented in those sectors where women do predominate, as opposed to the sectors where they don't predominate. There's an awful lot of emphasis on growth, high-tech, export-oriented, and some of the good programmes that are in existence focus on those areas. As I said before, women's entrepreneurship, to be effective, really does need to be embedded in a government's formal overarching entrepreneurship policy, and of course need to be linked to the wider entrepreneurial ecosystem. Something that was very evident in the report across all countries was the lack of evaluation or monitoring criteria. So that really is very important. Otherwise, we don't know what's really working. We might think we know anecdotally, but without the core research there and the hard evidence, it's difficult to highlight good practice examples and then to replicate them across other countries. So as we all know as researchers, women entrepreneurs are not a homogenous group. And what that means then is when it comes to policies and programs, one size really doesn't fit all. Next slide, please. So if we're looking to the future and we're trying to think about what government needs to do, well, the first thing they need to do is embed women's entrepreneurship into the overarching policy framework. They need to introduce more monitoring and evaluation, and that will enable them to highlight programs at work and policies at work and replicate them in other countries. I've already said that financial capital and access to financial capital was a big issue across all the countries. So more work needs to be done in that area, particularly in those sectors where women do predominate. And, you know, a novel idea, we need to start including women in the design and delivery of women's entrepreneurship programs and policies. And I think going forward, new policies coming forward have to try and do something about the impact of COVID, because we've been set back considerably. A lot of progress has been lost because, as we know, women entrepreneurs have been hit harder during COVID crisis. Their businesses were more likely to close than men's businesses, and they reported a loss in profits more so than their male counterparts. So just the next and final slide, please. And just to finish up, I just wanted to maybe let you know about some of the work that the GWEP group is trying to do. I think suffice it to say that as researchers, we all have a role to play in continuing to bring the key policy issues to the attention of policymakers. But in GWEP, we're working across three pillars. One is trying to connect with policymakers, and we've reached out to our network and asking our various research teams to bring this report to the attention of their local policymakers. We're also, you know, we have a collection of academic publications. Some we've published already, some are coming out in the near future. We'll have another few books and another special issue about to be announced. And then finally, collaborative reports, such as this report that we published with the OECD, and workshops, again, such as this one that Birkbeck are hosting for us. So finally, it's just all about getting the word out, because the more we do that, I think the more impact we can have and the more changes we can make. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm suggesting you think of your questions and you raise your hands afterwards, but that we take the two presentations together and we go straight on to Severine now and think a bit about France.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Is it possible to have to show my slides, please?
Yeah, can you see the slides there?
That's perfect, Orla. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for having me, and it's a great honor to serve you today. My name is Severine Loarne, and I would like to put on the table a couple of things about the situation in France, and I will try to reflect based on what Colette just said. So next slide, please. Thank you. So my outline is, I will not repeat what Colette just said because I did not participate to the writing of this very interesting and very fantastic report. However, this report and the reading of the report gave me key ideas I wanted to share with you. And based on this report, I will share my starting points. Then I will move on to explaining with some key figures of what's going on in France. And finally, I will try to explain how the situation is in France as regard to women entrepreneurship. And finally, I will conclude with my own personal scientific, I guess, interpretation of the situation and how we could improve the process. Next slide, please. So just the key point that was very, I consider it to be really interesting, and that could be typical of from France, from the situation from France, is women are 1.5 times less likely to start a business than their male counterparts in OECD countries. And we had three main identified reasons: institutional barriers, family policies, market failures, lack of motivation. And I was thinking it was very, very interesting and striking is how we are all coming from different countries. So we are facing different institutional contexts, institutional cultures, different histories. And how can it be possible that almost everywhere worldwide we face the same result? So this is, of course, this is a question I have, but I'm not capable of answering that question into 1 hour, maybe into several years, I don't know, but how it can be possible that everywhere we face results, whatever the situation, whatever the economic context, more or less. So this is very striking to me. And what was interesting is there is a kind of mimetism effect across countries to paste and copy policies or initiatives. And I found this was very, very interesting. And I will now explain you why. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if just to give you an idea of the kind of historical background of the situation in France. One key date is 1998, is not only the date when we won for the first time the World Football Club. However, it's because this is the starting point in 1998 when the current French Prime Minister decided to create a ministry of women just to solve women's stuff, generally speaking, in France. And the name of this minister is Lionel Jospin. And surprisingly enough, Colette, Professor Henry, you were mentioning that intellectuals or scholars need to promote women entrepreneurship, need to get more engaged. And the wife of this prime minister, Sylviane Agacinski, is a famous French sociologist who's quite engaged into gender issues. So maybe, I don't know, but maybe she must have a kind of impact on his spouse. Whatever. At that time, Lionel Jospin decided to recruit Geneviève Fraisse. Her name, please just remember the fact that she's a French philosopher specialized in gender issues. And what was very interesting, because at that time, I met Geneviève Fraisse several times, and when she told me the situation in 1998, she says, we decided at that time that we would like to reach the objective of the famous 30% of women entrepreneurs. And I asked her, why 30%? And she told me, when you have more than 30%, you have the feeling that there is a kind of diversity, and you don't even consider that there is any minority. So you don't, okay, men or women could be considered as to be the same. So that's why we decided to set up this famous objective of 30%. And till now, we are still struggling to fight and to get and to reach this level of 30% of women entrepreneurs in France. And before President Macron, under François Hollande, it was very interesting to note that when now the Minister of Affaires des Femmes left, she sent a note saying that, well, now we are more than 40% of women entrepreneurs. This was partly true, but this is a way to show we solve the issue, we gain. And it was in 2017. And of course, the topic is not gain, because if you have a look at these figures, so the source is come from, registration system, the registration software that said, okay, we have new companies, or we are, I'm by myself also an entrepreneur, and I get registered to that system. And the rate of women entrepreneurship in 2021 is 32.1%. But make no mistake, in that, under that figure, you've got lots of many self-employed women entrepreneurs. It doesn't mean that you have 32.1% of women entrepreneurs who are head of startups or of big companies. Definitely not. Just give you a zoom of the current situation in France, because these good figures, well, I would say good, it's not perfect, it's not pure equity, but these figures are just good because we have been facing the COVID crisis. And during that crisis, lots of women and lots of men decided to create their own self-employed company because of policy incentives. And meantime, because of lots of economic incentives, lots of fundings that have been given to the economy to support existing ventures, lots of ventures haven't gone bankruptcy yet. So I would say we can measure the real effect of COVID-21 or COVID-19 to COVID-2021 in the next years after the cut of all these supporting findings to the economy. But just to give you an idea, if you want just to get real figures, in 2020, more than almost 500,000 companies have been created in France, and only 20% have been run by women. And we also have a huge minority of mixed teams, meaning men and women alike. And the average age is 43 years old, so right after maternity issues in France. Next slide, please. And in terms of location, surprisingly enough, because France is a very centralized company, as you might know, Paris is the bad guy or the bad region. What's very interesting to know is the best region to promoting women entrepreneurship is Brittany. Brittany, so what you can see on the, nothing to do with Great Britain, I'm afraid, but it's located on the western part of France. And Corsica. Corsica and Brittany, we have two different reasons. Corsica, first, we are dealing with maternal families, maternal policies, maternal culture. So this is a mother culture. And in Brittany, we need to check, because this is very interesting. We are lots of private initiatives for women entrepreneurship, and lots of networks and the most famous networks to promote women entrepreneurship are coming from that place. And Aquitaine, this is the southeastern western part of France, is because, as I will show you in the next slide, we have lots of incentives that have been given, public incentive to promote the creation of new venture. Just to remind you that France, we make the difference between the metropole. So I would say France is type of country with small country in Europe, but also downtown, the countries or the departments you can find, in the big, in other places of the world, such as La Réunion, close to Africa, or Guyane, close to South of America. And in that places, we also face a super huge increase of new ventures that have been created by women. Next slide, please. So now, thank you. If we want to have a look of what's going on in France, now to give you how it gets organized. It's a bit complex to explain, and I don't have so much time for that. But just keep in mind that we have the national level, the regional level, and here on that picture you can, on that slide, you can see the different regions in France and the department level. And the national level, we definitely, incentives are coming from the national level. And most of the time, when any woman is bound to create any new venture, the best funding process, the best business angels, is called Pôle emploi. Pôle emploi is when you are out of job, you are applying, you get registered to Pôle emploi just to simply look for a job. And when you are women, you get some public policies and you get more fundings or more helps than when you are a male, just to create your own venture. On the national level, what's also very interesting is there is a kind of, let's say, partnership between big global companies, big global banks. I'm just thinking of BNP Paribas, for instance, was trying to work close with the government to promote women entrepreneurship. But most of these big companies are paying and are giving subsidies to more than 500 networks of women entrepreneurs. So it's really huge. Just imagine, and maybe it's a bit of nonsense, we have so many networks of women entrepreneurs, and sometimes we have more networks of women entrepreneurs than entrepreneurs per se. So it's a bit crazy in that respect. Of course, there is need to assess all this, of the whole impact of all these networks. Do they make sense? What are they? They're all making lots of noise, showing lots of role models, organizing roundtables, all these type of things. So this is what we have to promote women entrepreneurship, the national level, the regional level, and the local level as well. Next slide, please. But for what result? For what? What is the impact of such an effort? I would say, if I'm a bit skeptical, so you know I'm French, so I'm used to be, I got used to being educated to be critical and cynical as well. 70% of women entrepreneurs are self-employed. So I have the feeling that, okay, there have been a huge impact to promote women entrepreneurship and the creation of new ventures. This is super interesting. That's perfect. However, the rate of women entrepreneurship hasn't increased so much for 20 years. We're still around between 20 or 30% of job creations and new venture creations. And the impact, meantime, the fundings to promote women entrepreneurship and the creation of new ventures by women increase a lot. So much money for the same level of impact? Not sure this is quite, something must be wrong somewhere. The second point is, okay, if we have a look at the situation of newborn women entrepreneurs, or if you have a look at the situation of women entrepreneurs, with my research share, we try to work with a super famous network in France whose name is called Bouge ta boîte. And we've asked all these women who were declared as to be entrepreneur but self-employed. And we found out that most of them were receiving the benefit and the support from Pôle emploi. So they were lots of money and wages were still coming from states as if they were unemployed. And meantime, the revenues of their company per month is less than 1,500 euros. In France, you cannot live with less than 1,500 euros a month. So women entrepreneurship in France is to be considered as to be the second job of the family. Maybe not pocket money, but something you like, and it's like being housewife, taking care of children, and trying to get emancipating by doing something you like. So after 2 years, when subsidies from Pôle emploi are over, women entrepreneurs often come to the office saying, I don't want to live that way because I need more money and I want to live from my own revenues, which is unfortunately not possible. So just imagine if these women get divorced or simply are just lonely mothers is completely impossible. So that's the entry point to poverty. And my last comment is, okay, like Colette just said, women policies tend to consider women as to be a whole. So we have women in tech and women as a whole. Women in tech because tech should create and generate more revenues, more innovation. That's super good. But the rest, we are considering that women, simply because they are women, they all behave the same way. So they should create the second job. So they do assume that we are all married. We do assume that we all have a family. We do have to care with. We all assume that we are well educated. Our education doesn't matter. And maybe the fact to live into private economic or deprived economic zone has no impact. Or maybe when you live in a deprived economic zone, the only thing you can do is just to create a small or tiny company. But what happens when you have lots of ambition and when you want to create a bigger company? Subsidies are not here because you always receive subsidies just to promote small businesses, and this is not enough. So for that matter, I would tend to encourage better consideration of the micro context. Micro context, I mean, okay, we can differentiate countries, but also micro context. In France, we have more than 1,500 places that are considered as to be poor places. In that places, we have faced discrimination, immigration, lots of unemployment, and women policies face trouble entering these places. So what can we do for that? So that's the conclusion I would like to show. So maybe next slide, please. So as a conclusion, okay, lots of incentives, but not so super interesting results. And finally, lots of small companies in not revolutionary activities and a lack of consideration of the context. So these are the three main level of actions I would encourage scholars, but also managers to consider. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Severine. So let's go. Put up your hands and let's engage this. Probably need to. Ah, there's a hand. So there's one from Wendy there. How about Wendy Hine? Do you want to come in?
Hi, hello, hi, and hello, Helen. How are you? It's good to see so many good familiar faces, and thank you very much for these great presentations. And apologies for joining a little late. So I caught mainly Severine's great presentation. So thank you very much for these great insights. I'm just wondering. And I've just read through the synopsis of the OECD report as well. So I'm just wondering. I think you're right in the critique. I should say my background is marketing and gender in marketing, which overlaps to some degree with entrepreneurship, and because obviously markets can be just as starting up as entrepreneurship activities as well. So and as a reason that there's often an overlap between entrepreneurship and studies and marketing. But I think my main query is I agree with your critique in that an awful lot of the sort of actions that seem to be and recommendations that are put in place as a result of these absolutely dismal and worsening figures is often either to push it back onto individuals or to blame women and etc. And this has been going on, I don't know for how many years we've been there. So I'm just wondering if generally you have come across a more systematic framework that takes into consideration these various different complexities, these, as you say, sort of national and global and as well as regional sort of contexts, and as well as the different sort of more patriarchal systems that a lot of these different countries are facing. Because these are most of the barriers. I mean, these cultural barriers and basis of recognition of stereotypes of, as you say, institutions and family situations. So I don't know, it would really help me sort of to hear more your insight about some more of potential frameworks that exist to create more systemic actions and recommendations.
Will I start, if that's okay? Hi, Wendy, lovely to see you again.
Good to see you, Colette.
I think to answer your question, I mean, from a research perspective, I think institutional frameworks are really useful to analyse policy issues in different countries, because they throw up exactly the areas that you mentioned there, you know, patriarchal societies, cultures which are not conducive to encouraging or supporting women's entrepreneurship. So I think certainly I find using an institutional framework can give a more comprehensive overview of what the issues are. From a policy and practice perspective, I couldn't point to one particular existing government that sort of has it completely right. But certainly I think those governments that are heading in the right direction are those that embed women's entrepreneurship in their overarching policy framework. And I think Canada has really set the ball rolling on that. They have a very solid strategy and it's up there front and centre. So, you know, advocates or people who are passionate about women's entrepreneurship don't have to fight their corner because it's actually there embedded in policy.
That's great, thank you. No, I was interested more, obviously, from a research perspective. You know, I've worked in that too, but it seems to not somehow translate into policy.
Yeah, I think it's because it's so complex, you know. Severine, do you want to add to that?
No, I was thinking of what kind of other framework. You know, my background is sociology, so I focus more on practice. And I was thinking of two things, Wendy. The first one is I definitely share your view of if we consider that we all come from paternalistic societies, that's why most of the time in different regions, whatever the plate and the word, we find out the same results. And it's not me who mentioned that, it's the famous Sylviane Agazinski I was mentioning in the introduction of my presentation who claimed that. The second point I was considering is practice, because what we can observe are practice. When I go and I try to investigate, I use ethnographic studies, so I'm dealing with long ethnographic studies, but the idea of how women implement the praxis, you know, what we design as to be, okay, you should learn how to pitch, you should learn how to raise fundings, etc., etc. I notice that there are still differences across rich zones and the famous innovation clusters and poorer zone in that way. I know that in the marketing field, there is the research field which is called marketing as practice, but I have no idea of what's going on in that respect.
And so could I just add one more thing? I think just as Severine's been talking, two more frameworks come to mind, and one of them Severine mentioned in her presentation, that of context, any framework that deals with context. The work of Federica Welter, Candy Brush, for example, because context is so multifaceted and multidimensional, you know, you'll get a lot of mileage out of looking at women's entrepreneurship policy using context. And the other one would be just an ecosystems framework, because that can be quite comprehensive as well. Yeah.
No, that's really good. Thank you.
Okay, so how about hearing from Paula?
Hi, hello, thank you for the presentation. So my name is Paula, I'm a student at Birkbeck, and I will mention my age because it's important for the question, and I would like to be participating to the workshop more as a testimony. So I'm 49. I have been an expat, so you can hear from my accent that I'm French from Portuguese parents, so I came from immigration. And so with my ex-husband, we have been traveling around. I end up in UK, and I end up divorced. And now at the age of 49, I'm back to uni to have a degree, because actually when I was traveling, I couldn't really work because my level in English was really low, and also financially I didn't need that. And I found that the problem that women have is, well, it's there is no recognition of motherhood and also all the skill that we learn from it. And also this is what I experienced. Maybe that's not in your study. I just would like to be a testimony. And I was very grateful to be able to go back to uni and doing now a degree in international business. I did also this summer course in sustainability with Cambridge. So it was really interesting to learn about diversity. And I need to confess that even with getting those credentials, I feel not really certain that actually I will be employable because my age, but also because I don't have credential or background, and sometimes it's not easy to do it. And if I want to create a company, I need to have my own investment. How am I going to do that? It is a bit scary. And also I just would like to say that I've got my teacher, Helen, who have been teaching me last year entrepreneurship, and I really appreciate the impact that you had in our studies with the co-entrepreneurship and all that. But that's something which is not really available for people outside if they are not coming to university and trying. So this was just my testimony. Thank you.
Okay, Helen, you're on, Helen.
Okay, well, it's really about agency and ecosystems, because it's where the drivers are that make a difference. Is it women in senior leadership positions that are influencing government? Is the advocacy at the regional level that matters, or is it the heads of networks or large corporations? I'm interested in what brings about change so that you do get successful policies. And Canada's been mentioned, but there are other countries that are successful. And it's just what makes a difference. And if we can look at that to see whether there's anything generalizable, or is it just the process of making a difference that's important rather than the individuals that matter. It's how those individuals go about it in these different contexts.
So this is about how people influence women entrepreneurship policy and who they are.
Yeah.
Okay.
And why it is they that are able to make a difference? What is it that gives them that agency to make it matter in different contexts?
Well, maybe Severine's got an idea.
I don't know if it's an idea. I was thinking of Paula's testimony and the thought you were sharing. This reminds me of this network of Bouche ta boîte. This network is here to promote and to try. Well, the objective of this network now is to promote a lobby. And now what we face in some networks is not only the idea of sharing tips among women entrepreneurs, but into some other networks is also to welcome mayors, the head of cities, deputies, members of parliament, whatever, to come and to claim and to start doing lobby. you were mentioning, Paula, and that was very interesting, is the topic of motherhood. Well, when you've been working for different years, you can get not a degree, but you can get beyond 3 degrees, because we say, okay, you don't have the right education, but based on your former professional experience, we got this, this, and this. And it's not possible for being a woman, but if you've got 5 kids, I believe that in terms of management, you know things, and in terms of, I don't know, logistics, maybe you can arrange, you get a kind of know-how. And basically, this is this type of things that Bush Tabot is trying to do, and we are dealing with a kind of individual initiatives based on plus a leader, women leaders. We're trying to say, okay, and to take the lead, and then to see the French Parliament, and then to negotiate and to say, okay, to get the voice, to get the voice heard by politicians. It takes time because we are dealing with lobby. And I believe that there is room for research around that, on how you can better lobby and to get the voice heard, and what's the role of women into that respect, but also the role of males into that respect. So that's my...
Colette, thank you. Colette, you got something on this?
Well, I suppose just to say, I think in terms of trying to influence policymakers, timing plays a crucial role. If you're able to catch policymakers when they're about to renew their strategy that they haven't renewed in 5 or 6 years, and they really are looking around for things to say, if you've got some concrete evidence you want to bring to their attention, that's the time to do it. But there is also an element of political influence coming from the other way, because policymakers don't want to be told that something they've invested in doesn't work. So you have to be very careful about how you couch that argument. But I think timing is an issue.
Yeah, I would combine the two things. You know, the lobbying that has to be done with the evaluation evidence, and that's a gap. Because the lobbying, the key tool for the lobbying is the evaluation evidence that shows that this programme meets objectives, and potentially not just equal opportunity objectives, but growth objectives. But you have to have the evaluation that demonstrates the cost effectiveness. And that's where we are lacking. That's one of the things said in the report. We need more evaluations, but that's right across the board. It's not just for women entrepreneurship policy, but it's more important in a field that might need to become established. I mean, there's plenty more questions, but 3 o'clock and the time and so on. So I think maybe we pass it to Helen.
Okay, well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation, Jonathan. It was great sharing, setting the issues up, yep. And Tex and Colette and Severine, fantastic presentations, really good, and excellent engagement from people in who participated in the events. So thank you. That was really excellent. The material will be available, and thanks to Orla for setting it all up and working with us, and Isabel, who will be doing a blog for us. So it's a great team effort. So thank you. Thank you, Colette and Jonathan, for spearheading this. It's been wonderful. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Get the messages out. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.